All right, everybody. It's about 11 o'clock, so we're going to begin. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the California Coastal Resilience Network webinar series. My name is Ella McDougall, and I am the facilitator for the CRN, as well as the Climate Ready Fellow for the State Coastal Conservancy. The California Coastal Resilience Network promotes knowledge exchange through monthly webinars on climate-induced impacts on human communities and coastal habitats. We will provide a link to the network if you'd like to join or watch past webinars. We also post recordings of the webinars, including today's, on our site, whose links can be found in registration and in follow-up emails. Before we begin today's presentation, I want to take a quick minute to let you all know about the recent seethefuture.org website update. A few months ago, See the Future was launched, including as a webinar in this series, to serve as an educational tool about different California-based sea level rise prediction tools. This month, we've added a new tool, BCDC East Contra Costa Shoreline Flood Explorer. To learn more about this tool and to check out our website, you can navigate to seethefuture.org, C is spelled S-E-A. All right, let's get going with today's presentation, featuring the newly released BCDC Adapting to Rising Tides Bay Area Report. This report was released in early 2020 and is the first ever regional Bay Area comparison of the impacts of sea level rise on people, the environment, and the regional systems we rely on. We'll hear from Jacqueline Mandowski and Samantha Cohen. Jacqueline joined the BCDC Adapting to Rising Tides team in 2018 with experience in science writing, international marine conservation, local governments, and sustainability. Samantha has been with the ART team since 2019, having previously worked on water resource management and sustainable infrastructure projects for engineering consulting firms. We will listen and watch their presentation for about 40 minutes and then follow up with a Q&A session. During their talk, if you would like to submit questions, please do so using the chat box. I will collect, review, and read the questions, and Samantha and Jacqueline will respond. This webinar will be recorded and available for review later on today or later in this week. All right, with that, let's turn it over to Jacqueline and Samantha.
Thanks, Ellie. Hi, everybody, and good morning. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Jackie Mandowski, and as Ellie mentioned, I'm joined by my colleague, Sam Cohen. And we're really excited to share with you this project that we've been working on for just about 3 years now, ARC Bay Area. And the plan for the webinar today will be to provide some background and context for who we are at BCDC and the work that we do, some high-level findings from our massive new report, and some teasers for what we'll be doing next. So I always like to start with some background. BCDC is a state agency, but we work regionally in the San Francisco Bay. We were established in 1965 as the first coastal management agency in the United States, and we were created by 3 amazing women during the first wave of the environmental movement in the 1960s. BCDC was joined by the California Coastal Commission and the State Coastal Conservancy in the early 1970s, and together our 3 agencies make up California's Coastal Zone Management Program. So BCDC has a fascinating history. It was created due to a serious threat to the bay at the time, which was fill. San Francisco Bay is the largest estuary on the West Coast, and it's also relatively shallow, with an average of less than 15 feet deep. Since the 1800s, the bay was being filled with dirt, sediment, even garbage, as people sought to create more land to build upon. And BCDC was established to stop filling in the bay and to preserve and protect its natural resources as a public good for all to enjoy. These maps show a powerful story of what could have been the future of the bay, and also the rapid changes we're seeing today. By 1965, you can see that these white parts on the map here are areas of the bay that were filled. By 2020, without protections from BCDC on stopping fill, our beautiful San Francisco Bay would have only been the size of those 2 rivers. Thankfully, we still have a beautiful bay to enjoy, and our mission at BCDC is to protect and enhance the San Francisco Bay and encourage its responsible and productive use for this and future generations. This is where the story gets even more fascinating. Today, however, the bay faces a different kind of challenge. Instead of the bay getting smaller, rising water levels due to climate change are reshaping the bay once again. A new challenge is emerging, rising sea level. So the Adapting to Rising Tides program, or ART, was created at BCDC to help the region understand the risks of sea level rise and flooding, and to support local jurisdictions in their efforts to address these challenges. Over the last decade, the program has developed how-to guides for conducting vulnerability assessment and adaptation planning processes. We've partnered with local, state, and federal agencies on leading projects. We've provided data and maps on flooding, and we've conducted extensive research on topics related to sea level rise and flooding. So we've done quite a bit of work over the last 9 years or so. And just this year, we released 2 major reports. The first being ART Bay Area, a regional sea level rise vulnerability and adaptation study, an over 700-page document and the culmination of 3 years of work of understanding the impacts of sea level rise on regional systems across the Bay Area. This presentation will provide an overview of some of those results that came out of that work. We also released another exciting report, ART East Contra Costa County. This project evaluated vulnerabilities and consequences of flooding for the eastern portion of Contra Costa County at the Bay Delta interface. It also supported the creation of new flood mapping data in the Bay Delta to provide local jurisdictions in that region information on flooding from sea level rise and storms. And this is the tool recently launched that Ella mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, which I'll touch on next. As part of our work in the ART program, we developed flood mapping data and tools to interact with that data. The ART Bay Shoreline Flood Explorer, which is the image on the left, was launched over 2 years ago and provides an interactive way for individuals, cities, and really anyone to visualize and understand flood risks across the Bay Area. Already, it's been used by jurisdictions and communities to communicate flooding risks and advocate for adaptation planning. Our newest tool on the right is the ART East Contra Costa Flood Explorer, which displays data for the Bay Delta, which is hydrologically quite different than the Bay itself due to the presence of the Delta's freshwater input. The East Contra Costa tool was launched last fall, and you can use that tool to understand risks in the eastern portion of the county. All of this information is available now. You can view both of these tools at our website, and I've listed both of the names below, but they're generally at our website, adaptingtorisingtides.org, and you can use either Explorer dot or ECC Explorer dot before the Adapting to Rising Tides to get straight to that website. So one of the unique things about our program is the way we talk about flooding. We use a concept called one map, many futures, or the total water levels approach. And I'll walk you through this graphic. So near the bottom, you can see a white dashed line that says mean higher high water. And this really refers to the average of the daily high tides. So above that white line is a green dotted line, which represents in this graphic 24 inches above the mean higher high water. What the scenario boxes are showing are all of the different ways we could see water rising that same 24 inches above the average high tide. So this could happen from, say, a 5-year storm today, which could cause temporary flooding. That 24 inches could happen in the near future with a small amount of permanent sea level rise in a smaller 2-year storm, or other combinations of permanent and temporary flooding. Or it could happen from 24 inches of permanent sea level rise. This approach is valuable because it allows us to look at a map of a single total water level and communicate flooding that may result from different combinations of events. It provides us flexibility in understanding what the impacts of flooding could be at a given water level, and enables us to plan for short-term impacts today while also considering long-term risks in the future. And our work is always informed by the best available science. Because our total water levels are not tied to a specific date, we can utilize the most recent science to understand when these impacts are likely to occur. We created a graph to compare how the most recent state of California guidance on sea level rise projections compares to our mapped total water levels. This means that even as the science continues to improve, we can still use and understand consequences of flooding at a total water level and match them to the updated timing of when they may happen. Okay, so now that I've given you some background on our program and the way we refer to flooding, I'd like to dive into the meat of the presentation, which is really the ART Bay Area report. So this report serves to provide definitive answers about where flooding occurs and when. It provides a critical foundation to support and guide decision-making, It helps the region understand how they share vulnerabilities and the need to increase their capacity to work together. It primes a region-wide group of stakeholders for action and informs regional and local planning, such as Plan Bay Area, which I'll touch on more in a bit. And the focus of Art Bay Area is on 4 regional systems: transportation networks, vulnerable communities, future growth areas, and natural lands. These systems are interconnected and critical to the well-being of our region. We use transportation network, like roads and commuter rail, to get to places where we live, work, and play. We depend on healthy natural ecosystems to support our quality of life and provide recreation and outdoor opportunities to access the bay. And of course, we must consider how sea level rise and flooding will impact the most vulnerable populations among us and ensure that our actions for the future consider and protect these groups so that all of us can be more resilient in the face of the challenges before us. So Art Bay Area was created in partnership with many different entities. We were funded largely by a Caltrans Sustainable Transportation Planning Grant, hence the focus on transportation assets. We also partnered with the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, or MTC, and the Bay Area Regional Collaborative. We work closely with consultant partners, including AECOM, the Bay Area Regional Health Inequities Initiative, or BARHI, and the Natural Capital Project out of Stanford. We also, for the first time, worked with 2 community organizations, Ensuring Opportunity in Contra Costa County and Nuestra Casa in East Palo Alto. And a critical part of this project was aligning this work with other ongoing initiatives in the region. We work closely with MTC, working on Plan Bay Area 2050, which is the Bay Area's regional integrated land use and transportation plan, to ensure that the results of our work could be integrated into their planning process. As co-funders of this project, the future growth areas and natural lands component of Art Bay Area analyzed 2 important components of Plan Bay Area: priority development areas and priority conservation areas. PDAs are the priority development areas, and PCAs are the priority conservation areas. And PDAs are locally nominated in the region, and they're designated for increased housing and jobs growth. They signify important opportunities to increase housing density in existing urban areas near high quality transit to support the state of California's greenhouse gas reduction goals. PCAs are also locally nominated and represent the opposite of PDAs. They're areas designated to protect open space and natural lands. Sam will talk about this more a little bit later on. This project also built off of and incorporated concepts from the Adaptation Atlas, a report by the San Francisco Estuary Institute, or SFEI, and the San Francisco Bay Area Planning and Urban Research Association, or SPUR, that identified areas around the region and their suitability for nature-based adaptation strategies to sea level rise. Both of these examples represent how we work with partners in the region to advance and integrate our respective efforts on sea level rise. And one of the most unique and valuable parts of the ART program, and especially the Art Bay Area, is our regional working group. The ART program emphasizes broad stakeholder engagement throughout the process. And in Art Bay Area, we conducted 12 meetings throughout the region with a wide variety of stakeholders to build capacity, be transparent with our process and findings, and build a primed stakeholder group ready to take action. These are only some logos of the many organizations and people who attended. In total, over 500 people registered to attend our 12 meetings throughout this project. So now that we've shared who we are and what our report is about, let's get into some of the big takeaways. What did we find at risk? Our 700+ page report has a lot of data, but to make things easier to understand, we've provided some snapshots of risk. Over the next several decades, within 40 to 100 years, we could see 48 inches of total water level. So what does this mean for the region? It could mean that 5 million daily vehicle trips can't be made, and 60,000 daily rail commuters won't be able to get to work. It could mean that 28,000 socially vulnerable residents are impacted by flooding, with an additional 13,000 existing housing units and 70,000 new planned units in PDAs. On top of that, over 100,000 existing jobs could be impacted and another 85,000 new jobs at risk. It could mean 20,000 acres of wetlands, lagoon, and tidal marsh habitats are lost and drowned under rising seas. These are things that could happen if we don't prepare the Bay Area for impacts we know are coming. As part of this project, we looked at the region as a whole. We evaluated flooding and consequences of impacts across the 9-county Bay Area for 4 regional systems. And you can see these 4 systems represented by these 4 colors displayed on the map. And it becomes even more clear how truly connected we are. We evaluated these 4 systems at 10 total water levels, ranging from 12 inches or 1 foot, all the way up to 108 inches or 9 feet, an extreme sea level rise scenario. Our Bay Area report assessed these vulnerabilities at many scales, both regionally and locally. Today, we'll be talking about the results at the regional scale, and at the end, touch on some of the work we did at the local scale. So one of the most exciting things about this report is our use of evaluating consequences. And to do this, we identified data sets that provided a measure of consequence. For example, a consequence indicator for highways is the average amount of cars that use that segment of a highway. For vulnerable communities, it is the number of residential units in an area designated as socially vulnerable. We'll get to these examples and more next. So overall, we measured 32 different indicators across all 4 systems. I don't expect you to be able to read this table. This is mostly just to show the extent of the different ways we assessed impacts in the region. And we'll go through each regional system and provide an example of the kind of information available in the full report. Region-wide, these were the main questions that we asked. What gets wet? We identified areas with high flooding exposure, measured in things like number of highway miles flooded or acres of a priority development area. For the question of how bad does it get, we use the consequence indicators to understand the magnitude and extent of impacts. For question 2, we use these consequence indicators to understand where individual assets are contributing to high consequences and identified hotspots in the region where clusters of high consequence assets coexist. And lastly, Lastly, we conducted local assessments to look qualitatively at the big picture to understand what key planning issues emerged across the region from both the regional and local analysis to help us determine what actions we need to take next. So the first system we'll talk about is transportation. Our Bay Area evaluated multiple different kinds of transportation assets, from passenger rail lines to highways, high-quality bus routes, ferry terminals, airports, seaports, the San Francisco Bay Trail, and the region's bicycle network. I'm going to share an example of the different kinds of analysis we did for all the transportation assets, but really just focus on one indicator as an example. And we're going to look at a highway indicator at annual average daily traffic. So this graph provides us a picture of flooding exposure. Simply, how many highway miles are flooded at a given water level. At the bottom on the x-axis, we have our 10 total water levels, and on the left, our y-axis, we can see what's being measured. Here, it is the length of highway miles. If we use our example and look at 48 inches total water level, we can see that 59 miles of highway are flooded, which makes up 3% of the region's entire highway miles. 3% alone maybe doesn't sound like a whole lot when you compare it to the over 2,000 miles of highways in the region. But what does this really mean? This graph tells us the number of daily vehicle traffic impacted by flooding. In terms of consequences, that 3% of highway miles refers to over 5 million daily vehicles that no longer have a highway to use because it is now flooded. Exposure tells us one part of the story. Consequences tell us another. They can often tell us an even deeper story about impacts at the regional scale. Another way we share this information on consequences is by this amazing graphic that shows us where in the region impacts are highest. These are graphics that tell us this concept that we call first and worst. On this graph, you can see total water levels again on the x-axis, and individual highway segments are listed on the left. From this, we can see that the US 101 and I-580 in Marin County are highway segments that get impacted by flooding early. That is, at 12 inches total water level, they are seeing the worst consequences to daily vehicle impacts in the region. And while the US 101 is the worst impacted at 12 inches, with 520,000 vehicles, this graph also tells us that as water levels rise, we see consequences increase in other highway segments in the region. The darker the color of the boxes, the greater the magnitude of consequences. So we can visually see these changes. By 108 inches total water level, we see that the US 101 in Marin is still among the worst impacted, but other significant impacts in the region also occur in San Mateo and Alameda counties. This helps us understand where and how bad impacts occur. The last major way we visualize flooding impacts is through maps of consequence. This also tells us where consequences are happening, but gives us the information more spatially. Here we have our daily vehicles impacted. At 12 inches total water level, we see again that early disruption occurs primarily in Marin and Sonoma counties, which is not surprising as they already flood today. But by 48 inches total water level, which is the map on the right, impacts are felt across the region. And we can see that the worst consequences are more distributed across the region and really start to occur more so in the South Bay and the East Bay. So these kind of data are available, these different graphs that I just showed you are available in the full report for every indicator on the table I showed earlier. The full report presents this data in specific chapters, a chapter on transportation, vulnerable communities, future growth areas, and natural lands. So with that, I'm going to pass the presentation over to Sam, and she's going to continue to share some interesting results from the following categories, and also discuss ways we've considered and communicated shared risk and the need for shared solutions throughout the report. So with that, thank you everybody, and I will pass it over to Sam.
Thanks, Jackie. So in addition to transportation, our Bay Area also looked at mapping vulnerable communities. The goal of mapping social vulnerability with sea level rise is to identify areas where people will be impacted more heavily by flooding due to pre-existing social and economic stressors. There's precedent for similar mapping tools that illuminate social vulnerability, including Cal EnviroScreen 3.0. However, creating a new mapping tool was particularly important for ART, as Cal EnviroScreen uses census tracts, not block groups. Census tracts do not give a high enough resolution to capture key communities in the Bay Area. So BCDC and the ART program has developed their own social vulnerability characteristics relevant to sea level rise, which include both social vulnerability and contamination vulnerability. Contamination vulnerability is relevant due to the environmental justice impacts many vulnerable communities face, such as being located near hazardous waste sites or being near legacy contaminants, both of which could be mobilized during flood events. Next slide, please. So as you can see here, these are more detailed social and contaminant vulnerability characteristics. On the top, the social vulnerability indicators used in ART Bay Area can be seen on the top, and these do not represent all socioeconomic characteristics, but include those indicators which specifically contribute to increased vulnerability to hazards. These characteristics are not transposable with disadvantaged communities, which have a specific definition in state law. Disadvantaged communities include environmental hazards and adverse health impacts, such as poor air quality and respiratory health issues. To incorporate these elements of disadvantage, tools such as Cal EnviroScreen are cross-referenced in ART Bay Area. In addition, displacement screening was also added after the project's regional working group made it clear that it's necessary to consider displacement in early stages of planning and analysis, and not only considered when evaluating the impacts of adaptation strategies. So on the bottom, the contamination indicators can be seen, and these represent degradation or threats to communities and the natural environment from pollution. The presence of contaminated lands and water raises health and environmental justice concerns, which could worsen with flooding and sea level rise. A percentile score for the severity of contamination in each block group was calculated using data compiled by Cal EPA Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment for use in the Cal EnviroScreen 3.0. Next slide, please. So some of the impacts that we saw at 48 inches total water level included these three counties with the highest impacts. Marin County had the highest percentage of exposure at 37%, with 5,050 residential units exposed to flooding. While Alameda only has 4% of their block groups exposed, they actually had 6,470 residential units exposed at 48 inches total water level. And third, San Mateo County had the highest amount of socially vulnerable residents exposed, with 7,800 residential units and 3,640 residential units exposed to potential contamination. So we looked at these social and contaminant vulnerabilities for all of the 10 different total water levels across the bay. For a county, our data can tell you the relative, but also the absolute values. We mapped the entire Bay Area with this kind of information so that cities and counties can understand how many vulnerable residents may face additional challenges to flooding threats. By putting equity at the forefront, this can help adaptation planning better understand how to help the most vulnerable residents prepare for hazards. With the Bay Area's housing crisis, displacement by flooding could exacerbate housing affordability issues. Next slide. We also looked at future growth areas, which MTC ABAG defines as priority development areas, or PDAs, which Jackie talked about earlier. These areas help define where in the region future growth will occur, and it includes indicators for both current and future residential units and jobs. So the next graph I'm going to show you is just going to focus on residential units. Next slide. So this graph shows residential units. On the x-axis is total water levels, and on the y-axis is total exposure of residential housing units. In dark blue, it shows existing units. In bright blue, it shows projected total units in 2040. And in teal, it shows the growth or change from 2010 to 2040. Projected growth in residential housing units could put nearly 3 times more residential households in areas at risk at 108 inches total water level when compared to the existing housing units at risk of impacts from flooding if no adaptation occurs. In general, the earliest and most significant consequences of impacts from flooding on both residential units and jobs are distributed in PDAs across the North Bay, in North San Jose, and a few PDAs in the East Bay. Later consequences become increasingly concentrated in San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose. Ongoing discussions between BCDC and MTC ABAG are working towards incorporating these assessment results and possible adaptation responses into Plan Bay Area 2050 to protect people, jobs, and future development from a rising bay. The main takeaway here is that we need to be careful how we plan for new housing and new jobs, making sure to protect them from future risks such as sea level rise. Next slide. The fourth and final regional system that we looked at was natural lands. This included MTC ABAG's priority conservation areas, or PCAs, as Jackie talked about earlier, as well as other natural lands. The indicators shown here include looking at how sea level rise would affect recreation and visitation rates, stormwater retention and infiltration, habitat, including endangered species habitat, agricultural lands, and carbon storage. Next slide. So shown here in this graph is the indicator for impacts to tidal marsh habitat. Tidal marsh habitat experiences early and dramatic impacts to habitat since much of tidal marsh habitat is only within a foot or two of the mean sea level in the bay. If you can see this, the 12 inches versus 108 inches impacts are not really that dramatic. There's only a little bit more acreage that's added from the huge increase in total water levels. This means that most of the greatest impacts seen around the region occur very early on. The biggest impacts are seen geographically in the Napa, Sonoma, Point Edith or Contra Costa, and South Bay Baylands areas. Next slide. So after these 4 regional systems, we tried to figure out how they all interacted together. One of the analyses that we did was looking at various hotspots around the region. This means areas where critical assets are co-located. These locations are areas ripe for coordinated adaptation planning at the local and regional level and indicate places where planning done in silos could adversely affect neighboring assets or jurisdictions. These regional clusters represent a starting point for the region to identify high priority areas for adaptation that could receive support from the region through technical assistance, resources, or incentives to ensure that these areas are protected first. These locations may also provide the biggest bang for the buck. For example, these regional hotspots can lead to protecting many assets the region cares about in a single planning process or project, collectively saving time and resources. So what are hotspots? Hotspots are driven by the highest regional consequences co-located together in an area. These hotspots include the top 5 consequences in transportation, PDAs and PCAs, as well as any vulnerable community block group. For example, we identified the top 5 highest consequence segments of highway, the top 5 highest consequence ferry terminals, or the top 5 PCAs with the largest area of tidal wetlands impacted. The exception was for vulnerable community block groups, as all vulnerable block groups were considered equal in this methodology. Then we determined which were co-located together and which contains at least one transportation asset, at least one PCA or PDA, and at least one vulnerable block group. Next slide. Shown here are the hotspots which emerge at 12 inches total water level. These are San Rafael, Corte Madera, Larkspur, and Martinez. The San Rafael cluster is driven by multiple transportation assets, including Highway 101, the 580, the SMART train, and the Bay Trail, as well as impacts to downtown San Rafael, with jobs and residential units being impacted, and by block groups experiencing social vulnerability as well as contamination. The Corte Madera Larkspur cluster is driven by impacts to Highway 101, the Larkspur Ferry Terminal, the Bay Trail, and a portion of the regional bicycle network, as well as impacts to Central Marin Bayfront PCA, which experiences high impacts to lagoons, as well as visitation and a vulnerable block group. And finally, the Martinez cluster is driven by impacts to lagoons, the endangered species of Ridgway's rail habitat, and tidal marsh habitat in the Point Edith wetlands, as well as impacts to the Port of Martinez and the Union Pacific Freight Rail. And they also had impacts to socially vulnerable and contaminated block groups. So this gives you an example of what some of the co-located impacts to assets were in our hotspots. What's important to note is that the regional clusters change location over time as flooding increases. This is due to more assets being exposed at higher total water levels. Since clusters are driven by highest regional consequence, an asset that may have the highest consequence at 12 inches may not have the highest consequence at 48 inches total water level when more assets are exposed. This means that clusters that emerge early on as regionally important may no longer appear to be regionally important later on. Next slide. As flooding increases, new exposure drives new clusters to emerge and other clusters to fall off as assets with higher consequences start to get wet. So as you can see here, at 24 inches total water level, San Rafael no longer appears as a regional cluster, despite worsening impacts in that area. Local vulnerability and consequences are still critical, but as other assets get wet, higher regional consequences occur elsewhere. So for example here, the Marin City cluster is driven by impacts to the regional bicycle network, lost visitation to the Bothon Waterfront PCA, and from social vulnerability in local block groups. Another example here is the downtown Oakland and West Oakland cluster, which is driven by downtown and Jack London Square PDA, with impacts to residential units and job units, as well as impacts to the Port of Oakland, the Jack London Ferry Terminal, and significant social vulnerability and contamination. Next slide. Many of the same clusters from 36 inches total water level remain at 48 inches total water level, but a few new ones emerge, which remain stable over higher total water levels. In addition to the clusters at 36 inches total water level, the Corte Madera Larkspur reemerges. San Francisco Mission Bay and San Francisco Embarcadero emerge as high importance clusters, and Suisun City and Alameda drop off in regional criticality compared with these other assets. For the San Francisco Mission Bay cluster, it's driven by the Mission Bay PDA with impacts to residential units and jobs, the 3rd Street Muni line, and social vulnerability and contamination. The San Francisco Embarcadero cluster is driven by the Port of San Francisco PDA, the San Francisco Ferry Terminal, a Muni bus route and Muni rail line, along with multiple socially vulnerable and contaminated block groups. Next slide. So while we did a lot of analysis on these 4 regional systems, we also tried identifying cross-cutting issues in the region through the creation of regional key planning issues. Regional key planning issues are challenges that require the collective focus of the region, either because they represent challenges larger than any single jurisdiction could solve on their own, or there are challenges that are common to many locations within the region and would benefit from a coordinated approach. Our Bay Area identified 8 regional key planning issues. Along with these key planning issues, we developed suites of adaptation solutions. These 5 categories were how we organized our adaptation approaches: funding and financing mechanisms, programs and operations, build a project, capacity building, and plans and policies. While each key planning issue has numerous amounts of adaptation solutions possible, I'm just going to list one for the first key planning issue to give you an idea of what we came up with. Next slide. So the first key planning issue is transportation hubs come together and flood together. An example of a strategic adaptation response is to establish regional priorities for high consequence transportation clusters that connect multiple transportation types, such as roadways, rail, bike, and bus, that connect scales of service, such as local, subregional, and regional systems, and that connect types of service, such as moving people or freight for goods, as well as service to vulnerable communities. We can use regional funding mechanisms to plan and implement protection measures in these locations. So in addition to identifying strategic responses, we categorize them in those 5 categories I mentioned on the last slide, as well as laid out the key players responsible for helping to implement these adaptation responses. For this example that I gave, MTC ABAG, Caltrans, BART, County Transportation Authorities, and the U.S. Department of Transportation would be entities responsible for helping to implement that adaptation response. Next slide. The second key planning issue is sea level rise decision-making is complicated by ownership, governance, management, and regulatory issues. Local capacity to plan for sea level rise and carry out projects is highly variable around the region. Some highly resourced cities and counties have done extensive analysis and planning, while other communities lack staff to do daily planning, much less long-term speculative planning. The third key planning issue is interconnected local and regional emergency and critical service functions are at risk. So for example, critical services such as water, wastewater, electricity, and communications may also be at risk, which can exacerbate the impacts of a disaster event or cause cascading emergency situations. Many community serving centers like schools, places of worship, and libraries that serve critical functions in emergency events may be inundated and unable to serve both local and regional populations, exacerbating impacts, and especially to community members who lack private resources to prepare for, respond to, or recover from a disaster. Next slide. The fourth key planning issue is that contamination complicates and exacerbates flooding issues. Many areas at risk of flooding are on or near former industrial sites that have been designated as contaminated areas. Exacerbating this issue is the fact that many vulnerable communities have been pushed to marginal lands adjacent or even on contaminated lands. Development pressure in the Bay Area due to lack of housing is also pushing some of the more centrally located former industrial sites towards new housing and jobs. There's significant uncertainty about how flooding and rising groundwater will exacerbate contamination and increase public health concerns if contaminants are mobilized, or how dry land cleanup standards that we use to clean up these sites will perform if lands become permanently submerged. The fifth key planning issue is that sea level rise will amplify existing housing and displacement concerns. For example, many vulnerable communities are disproportionately exposed to sea level rise and, in many cases, live in poor quality, older housing that is especially sensitive to flooding, while being least prepared to adapt to sea level rise. This creates another factor for displacement. Next slide. The sixth key planning issue is that future development areas can be a critical tool for resilience. For example, careful planning for new development in the highest risk areas ensures that future residents avoid or reduce vulnerability from the get-go. This could mean reducing density, planning for flood control from the start, or avoiding new growth altogether, depending on what other factors are influencing the location's suitability for growth, such as greenhouse gas reduction potential, affordability, or equity. The seventh key planning issue is that sea level rise will put pressure on the relationship between regional recreation and habitat. Many of the region's vulnerable recreation areas are co-located with sensitive habitat areas that are also at risk. Many of these areas of co-location could play critical roles in flood management through nature-based solutions. However, different stakeholders may have differing priorities for the management of natural shoreline areas that prioritize people, natural systems, or flood control, amongst other things, over one another. Shoreline adaptation approaches should balance recreational uses such as required public access, access to recreation, and nature-based education with the protection of essential ecosystem functions, especially preservation of habitat for threatened and endangered species, carbon sequestration, sediment management, biodiversity preservation, and flood control. Next slide, please. The last key planning issue is nearshore habitats and the ecosystem services that they provide are sensitive to sea level rise early on. Nearshore habitats provide significant natural and ecosystem services, such as habitats for endangered species, carbon sequestration, wave attenuation, and contribution to recreation and regional character. However, in many locations, natural ecosystems will be the first locations to be impacted by sea level rise. So protecting, restoring, and enhancing nearshore habitats can provide many benefits. However, to maintain these benefits, early action must be taken and careful consideration should be given to several key factors, such as protection of migration space, changes in management of endangered species habitat or fisheries, increasing linkages among different habitats in upland areas, and an understanding of how habitat restoration can or should integrate into longer-term shoreline protection plans. So that summarizes our 8 key planning issues that we came up with. And this map shows where, beyond the 4 regional systems that we looked at, we also did a deep dive into 32 locations around the Bay in order to better understand how these regional systems were being impacted at the local level. These local assessments are available for download on our website. Next slide. We looked at something called the Operational Landscape Unit, which is the black outline in this map. And operational landscape units are a geographical planning unit that San Francisco Estuary Institute came up with based on watersheds and geology of the Bay. Within these, we looked at the 4 regional systems, as you can see on the left, within these focus areas, which are the black and white rectangles on the map. Next slide. And this final map shows which of the 13 operational landscape units are available from download from our site. Next slide. So after looking at all of these different analyses in the Art Bay area, we released the report in April. And even though, despite we released in the middle of COVID-19, so far we've still gotten a good amount of attention from the media. And highlighted here are just some of the articles that have been shared. Next slide. So what's next for art? We are going to be continuing to work with MTC and Plan Bay Area 2050 to help the region look to the future and how future housing, growth, and transportation can help become resilient to sea level rise. We also plan to do a regional roadshow, which with the presence of COVID has become complicated, but we will still probably be doing some digital presentations and meetings with folks around the region so that they can better understand how sea level rise and storms will affect their jurisdictions. Art is also creating some new projects, such as creating local adaptation guidance and funding and financing for adaptation projects. Finally, BCDC is helping to coordinate Bay Adapt, which is a regional strategy for a rising Bay. Bay Adapt is trying to build consensus around problems and resources that the Bay can put together in order to create a united vision around how the Bay Area should react to sea level rise. And finally, you can download the Art Bay Area report on our website. And Jackie and I are available to answer any of your questions now, or feel free to email us if you have additional questions or you'd like us to present at your community or agency. And thanks so much for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for such an interesting presentation. It was fascinating. I really loved all of your highlighted policy issues. I felt that that really captured some of the difficulties for people who are planners and practitioners around sea level rise. So thank you so much. We do have some great questions. So we're going to go ahead and go through those. And I will read off the first one. So most engineering references define total water level to be the sum of water level and wave run-up. Does the ART TWL include wave run-up?
Hi, I can take that question. That's a great question, and the answer is no. The total water level concept that we use is very specific to water level above. We really used a water level as well as the DEM, digital elevation model. So one of the things that our data does not include are the wave run up. It doesn't include kind of fluvial flooding. So we do recognize that how we talk about total water levels is different than how engineers talk about it. And we're actually in the process of developing some guidance at BCDC to clarify some of the ways that we talk about this. But our intent is really for planning purposes and not, our maps are really not meant to be used at a parcel scale. They're meant to be used at a larger planning scale, so that there is a difference in how we talk about that concept.
Great, thank you. The next question is again about total water level, and it reads, the strategic response to temporary flooding and permanent flooding will be different, i.e. response to periodic flooding of a road can be managed, but permanent flooding totally removes the capacity of the road. Does total water level reveal those different risk components?
We really use the total water level to understand consequences at that water level. So you're correct in that the response may be different if it's temporary versus permanent. But we really just use that as a way to understand if water reaches this amount, whether it's temporary or permanent, what could happen. And then that's really in the decision maker's hands in how they want to use that information. So we don't necessarily determine that. It's really meant to provide information on if water hits this asset, what could happen, and then the responses would be different depending on when that's likely to happen. So that's more captured in our adaptation responses.
Okay, great, thanks. The next question asks if beaches can be or are included as habitat or perhaps PCAs, priority conservation areas?
I can take that question. We did look at beaches in our natural areas and looked at total acreage of how many would be affected. We also looked at some different habitats such as playa, lagoons, subtidal marshes, and then a couple of different endangered species, specific endangered species habitat around the bay.
Okay, thank you. Next question asks, how will public access be protected or adapted with future sea level rise? And is elevating an option?
I can take this question. So public access, we did look at public access through impacts to roads. So sometimes an asset, and we especially got into this in our local assessments because that was able to give us a more granular scale to actually get into understanding specific sites. So if road access was blocked to a certain site, such as parking lot for a park, we said that the entire park would be affected. And other public access, especially for the Bay Trail, which is something that BCDC is heavily involved with, and the Water Trail, both of these are on the coast. And so we've been thinking a lot about how coastal access will be affected by sea level rise. Elevating is definitely an option, but what happens is that because the shoreline is owned and operated and maintained by so many different parties, we can give people guidance on how they should respond to adapting their shoreline, but it's ultimately up to these individual shoreline owners on how they want to adapt. Elevating is an option, like some people build levees and then put public access on top of the levee. You can also have some type of boardwalk situation or floating platform. I hope that answers your question enough.
And maybe I'll add something too. One of the things that we do largely at the ART program is think about not only built solutions, and we really don't necessarily give built solutions. We really focus on governance and looking at these vulnerabilities. And as Sam mentioned, often there's a lot of jurisdictions, a lot of different managers and owners involved. So a lot of the adaptation responses we developed are about capacity building, coordination, who needs to be talking to each other in order to ensure that these things are happening in a more coordinated way, program and operations. So while built projects are absolutely essential, we really focus a lot of our work on what are the other actions that need to be taken. And as Sam mentioned, we can provide guidance. We look at this report as a decision support tool, and we have strategies on regional actions to take, but ultimately decisions lie in those local jurisdictions. And so we want to facilitate how those decisions can be made in a more coordinated way.
Great, thank you. And we just received a follow-up question to this, which is, if local governments don't respond appropriately, can BCDC step in to prescribe what should be done, as opposed to just giving guidance?
No, currently we cannot. So BCDC's authority and jurisdiction is quite specific to the Bay itself. So as I mentioned, we were really created primarily to stop fill in the Bay. And then we also have authority over a 100-foot shoreline band. And so in our regulatory sense, we do ensure that permit applications are resilient to sea level rise to mid-century and adaptable to 2100. And in looking at the shoreline band, that's quite specific to public access. So we can ensure on a regulatory side that public access is resilient to sea level rise, but we don't have the authority to really go outside of that 100-foot band or to really ensure that local jurisdictions focus on other components. That's just not quite in our purview. And at the ART program, because we are not regulatory in the ART program, that's really where we try to broaden our scope and get people to coordinate more voluntarily. So we don't actually have the authority to force it unless it is through specific individual permit applications.
And just to clarify and builds on what Jackie said, If a city is coming to us with a permit application, all of our projects require public asset access on the shore. And as Jackie said, it needs to be resilient to sea level rise. So if let's say it's the local government doesn't respond with a shoreline solution that is adequate, then we could work with them to develop a solution that would be adequate to be resilient to sea level rise.
Great, thank you both for your time with that question. Another one asks if you can speak a bit more about local adaptation guidance project in terms of what that is and the timing.
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about that. So the ART program has really done a lot of work in developing planning processes. And we've done a lot of work on vulnerability assessments, defining issues. And we have a section of our plan that's about developing strategic adaptation responses, but we realize that there's actually quite a lot more of work that needs to go into identifying solutions. So this adaptation guidance, we actually drafted an initial version of this last fall, and we're currently in kind of a 6-month timeline of rescoping that work, inviting a lot more stakeholder perspectives to provide input on that guidance. And really the goal of that guidance is to help clarify the steps needed to get to using the results of a vulnerability assessment and really getting to a set of solutions that are really built by a community and a city's vision, guided by guiding principles that are developed with a lot more input early on, and that the decisions that you're creating are really bundled and phased. So you're thinking about both short-term risks and what actions you want to take that really meet the local context and conditions and align with your community's goals and visions. So you're thinking both about short-term strategies as well as longer term. So really trying to integrate adaptation pathways approach and thinking about how do actions we take now impact actions we may want to take later, and thinking through that in providing more robust guidance to really get you there. So if you're interested in that, feel free to email me, Jackie Mandowski. I'm leading that initiative, and we're really kind of kicking off a new big scoping and research phase where we really want to get more input on what this should look like, what it should include to ensure that it's most valuable to local jurisdictions.
Yeah, and the only thing that I'll add is the reason why we decided to create this adaptation guidance is because we ourselves were actually struggling with how to move from vulnerability assessments into adaptation. So we decided to create kind of a more step-by-step guide in order to make it more understandable how you take these vulnerabilities and start to think about adaptation.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. That's about all we have time for today. So again, I want to thank Jacqueline and Samantha so much for your hard work and time sharing about this great project. Folks, for those who are listening and watching, you can download the ART Bay Area report, and also Jacqueline and Samantha's email addresses are up on the screen. And we will be creating a recording of this webinar and sending it out as soon as it's ready. So thank you all so much for your time today and your attention, and we hope that you stay productive and healthy. Have a great rest of the day.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank
everyone.
you so much, everyone.
Yep.